بس خلونا دلوقتي نبدأ presentation with Mr. Patrick Christian, Senior Researcher, TeleGeography, Colocation and Connectivity, the intersection of data center and international network in the MEA region. نرحب بيه.
Good afternoon. And thank you. First, I want to start off thanking Mohammed and Osama for inviting me to speak today. He speaks, much higher than, well, anyway, you'll see. But I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to be in Cairo. Everybody's great. Really warm welcome. Excellent. It's good stuff. And I believe, as Mohammed was saying, what we're known for at TeleGeography is we're very data-driven. So we have huge data sets on all different types of infrastructure. From what we're probably most known for are submarine cables, but any type of connectivity. We look at IP networks and data centers as well. And what we've been talking about today is, or what we're here to talk about is data centers. But what I'm going to be talking about is the connectivity to the data center as much as the data center, because it's very difficult to just build a data center and drop it somewhere, and for it to be successful if it is not well connected and in a growing hub. And what I'll talk about is a lot of the details on how the connectivity is there, okay? And all this data is collected directly from all the providers all over the world for all the telecoms, all the data centers, etc. And we just aggregate it and put it up into pretty maps and talk about it like that. So, okay. And I'm sorry, but there's no screen in front of me, so I'll have to go like this. Mohammed. Oh, and I also want to say before I get started, Mohammed did a great job of succinctly talking about data centers and the evolution, so I don't have to talk about that, but that will be part of the presentation. So thanks, Mohammed, for starting off that way. Nice to see you again. It's been a moment. Okay. Do I have control? Thank you. Okay. How's that look? Okay, first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to start off looking at, we'll start up high, because I'm here to talk about global, and we look at global, but we'll put where Middle East and Africa sits in the global picture, but we'll start off looking global, and then we'll move down and look into Middle East and Africa, the bandwidth trends. Bandwidth just means the connectivity on networks to have internet, or how you connect to data centers and the content there. And then we'll move down and talk a little bit about data centers and interconnection hubs, talking about we've talked about this a little bit so far, but in a little bit more detail of where the hubs are, what makes a hub, and how hubs grow. And then we'll talk a little bit about end user demand too, which is also very important with the growth of internet and demand. So first with global. Wow, it's really stretched out. Okay, here we're looking at the past up until now, and there we're looking at forecasted or the future. But we see that Africa is fastest growing. This we're talking about bandwidth, so connectivity or transmission between countries. And Africa, it also started from a smaller base, so we're seeing a lot more growth. Middle East is still good, but it's in the kind of average, global average. And then looking forward, Africa should be growing almost 40% over the next 4 years, and Middle East is in the global averages around 30%. And one thing we need to talk about too is when we talk about hyperscalers connecting data centers, what we're talking about, if it's connecting between regions or continents, we're talking about submarine cables, of course. So it's good to keep an eye on what's happening with submarine cables, because if we watch submarine cables, we kind of have an idea where hyperscalers want to go or are moving or are building their submarine cables or their consortium cables to connect these data centers. So in the next 3 years, we're seeing $11 billion of investment. It's a huge amount of growth that it takes going back to the early 2000s before we see growth like this. So this is all announced investment. And why do we see this? Because globally we're seeing demand, and we're talking about capacity growing at 20 to 30% a year. So to meet the demand, commercial factors like reducing unit costs, and this is a very important aspect for hyperscalers, is to enhance route diversity. Because as we saw what happened in Africa, Middle East, with at the beginning of the year, the cable cuts in the Red Sea and off the coast of Côte d'Ivoire, we saw a lot of problems with connectivity. So even though there are 3 or 4 cables per side, long haul cables that go all the way down, for the hyperscalers, they see this and they say, oh, we need more connectivity. Okay, more resiliency. So we'll be seeing a lot more cables coming in. And also a lot of the cables are aging out. Primarily on the Africa side, a lot of the cables came in around 2010, about 2008, 2012. And these cables are starting to get older, economically almost end of life. So it's getting closer. And this is just a map, because telegeography is maps, that shows the most recent cable systems in red, the planned cables in gray, and then all the blue dots are basically how many landings per location. And if you look closely, where do you see a ton of landings over the next few years? A lot of it around the peninsula in the Middle East and the northeast side of Africa, of course, including Egypt. And that's why we're here. And then what this image shows is it shows where all the planned data centers, hyperscaler cloud data centers, have been announced to be built. And if you see, once again, very densely around the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, and in Africa. Now, a couple of things that are important to talk about when we're talking about the growth and the connectivity is pricing. I'm not sure. Let's see if it's, but this is the weighted medium of 100 gig IPT transit, basically buying internet. And this shows in the world the prices. Basically, green is a very low price globally, and red is a very high price. So we see 3 areas left with very high prices for connectivity or IP transit. It's in the Middle East area, India, and Australia. And then if we look at, this is showing the rate of decline. We see the red is a slow rate of decline, and the yellow and green, or the green, is a fast rate of decline. India is declining a little faster. South Africa has been declining very quickly recently, but Middle East and some parts of East Asia are holding. And then in the U.S. and Western Europe, there hasn't been much of a drop because prices are already so low. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, now looking at MEA trends. This is just focusing in on basically what I said before. Highest number of cables for Africa are really concentrated up in this section, northeast. But there are a lot of cables going in, but in smaller numbers around the continent. These are some of the cables that are either planned or recently launched. And there, once again, the red is launched, and the gray is in the process of being launched or still in planning. But I'm not going to talk a lot about these, but Equiano, Africa 1, which just landed in Cairo not too long ago, Roman, etc., and CMEWE is coming through. This is an image of all cables, submarine cables, or the most recent ones that have been launched, covers everywhere. But if we look at what's in the planning, and you drop that on top, once again you see a concentration around the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. Okay, now when we talk about submarine cables, we're talking about the pipe, of course, and what we're talking about in this slide is the IP capacity, or basically the internet capacity, how big the internet is. If we look at Africa, and there's another slide on the Middle East, but if we look at Africa, something that stands out is the biggest lines are all going to Europe still. We are starting to see it grow within Africa, but a lot of the biggest lines are still going to Europe. And this historically has been because a lot of the content, a lot of the hosting, everything was based in Europe, well, US, then Europe, and now in some parts of East Asia. And that's where all the content is. You have to connect up to that to watch those videos, etc., to pull it down to where you are, okay? So historically, 80%, okay, we're gonna go straight to that, okay. Now this is looking in the Middle East, and really, oh, and I forgot to mention in the last one, if you look at the circles represent the total international IP capacity connected to that country, okay? So the bigger the circle, the more IP connectivity to the country. You see Turkey up at the top is huge. Historically, they've been a very large hub connecting Europe, Asia, and Middle East. And we see in a lot of the other countries in the Middle East, smaller circles, and a lot of the connectivity was directly back to Europe, not connected between the other countries within the region. We'll talk about more of that later, because that has a big effect on being a hub. And if we look at the Middle East, and this is very similar to Africa, is like we were saying, about 80% of all international connectivity is back to Europe, okay? And then I'll talk about, well, I'll go to this slide. Okay, what this slide shows is Europe has been a hub of content, like the US, since kind of the beginning of time for internet. And both the Middle East and Africa run at about 80% connectivity still goes to Europe, okay? And like I said, if you don't have the data centers in Africa or the Middle East, a lot of your content is still pulled out of Europe. So what we're watching is more of the content data centers are built in Africa and the Middle East, you see these patterns change. But one thing we've always seen with Africa, and it's always held steady at about 80% international connectivity to Europe, and we're wondering why, because we know all these data centers are being built, especially in South Africa, but other places in Africa. But what we see if we split out North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa is that North Africa rarely connects to neighbors or other countries. It's mostly back up to Europe. And this is based on geography and history, that a lot of the major cable systems that connected the two were to Europe. It was very easy, very cheap, and there are a lot of data centers there. So this is why you see the connectivity almost 100% still to North Africa. Whereas you see in southern or in sub-Saharan Africa, what happened is now you're getting a lot of data centers that are built in South Africa. So a lot of the companies are rerouting traffic. Instead of getting content out of Europe, they're getting content out of South Africa. So we're seeing that move a little. And then what this is showing is kind of the difference. The blue in this case is Europe connectivity, and the orange is the connectivity to within Africa. And South Africa is now about 60-40, 60% to Europe, 40 is African. And they've traditionally been a hub. Usually you want to see a lot more of the closer countries, a higher number, but with South Africa, there's so much connectivity in such large kind of increments to Europe to pull down content that the connectivity within Africa at the moment, say to the neighbors like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Botswana, etc., they're much smaller connections. So there's probably many more connections, but they're at a smaller scale. So that's why it shows up that way. Nigeria is actually, even though it's becoming a hub, you do see that this is very traditional, historic of African and Middle Eastern countries, is that the highest percentage, the vast majority of the amount of connectivity internationally is to Europe still, okay? And then only 20%. A lot of this is because also they're just focusing, they have a huge local market and local demand, so they don't need to connect to their neighbors to share kind of the local content they pull down from Africa. So this is where you see, it's very common. Kenya is a little bit different because Kenya has a lot of onward connectivity to countries that aren't on the coast. So you'll see that they have a lot more African connectivity because they provide content and connectivity to the countries around them inland, like Rwanda, Uganda, etc., all the way to the DRC. And then DRC, that's an interesting one because really it should be more blue than orange, but DRC is a very strange country, as in very classic or different from a lot of countries because it's so large, has so many borders that they have a lot of borders that they connect to, and a lot of new companies that are laying fiber that have a very, 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 very high capacity. So this is why you see this may only be like 4 connections across the border, but they're the new builds, new fiber builds that have a lot of capacity. Now, if we go to the Middle East, don't throw things at me. Okay. Egypt at the moment is very highly concentrated in pulling a lot of content from Europe, okay? Egypt is beautifully located, perfectly located for all the submarine cables to go by. So it's perfect in that sense. But there are other difficulties, or what everybody's here to do is build more data centers, okay? So you'll start pulling content into, or having content within Egypt, okay? And then you'll start to see it as a hub, and you see the orange or the connection to the other areas start to grow. And there's issues of connectivity too, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But if you look at the same thing, Saudi Arabia, there's a little bit more connectivity just because of their location too. There's a mix. They have some Middle East in Asia, which is mostly India, but you're seeing a little bit of different growth. Iraq is kind of like Nigeria. It's a high concentration back to Europe, but they are starting to be more connected to neighbors. And then UAE is maybe the closest to kind of a hub in the sense of connecting a lot of the neighboring countries and regional players. So you see a mix of Asia, Middle East, and other. Other is a lot of Africa. Okay, and now we'll look at Africa first, and then we'll do a slide on the Middle East. But for Africa, now we've taken out all of the connectivity to Europe, and we're only talking about connectivity to other African countries, okay? So here we see the circles and the lines are a lot smaller, okay, so in growth mode. And you see that a lot of activity is concentrated around South Africa, because South Africa, once again, very far away from Europe. Once they started building their big data centers, it just made sense that as long as prices are lower to get to the country, a lot more countries are connecting to it to get the content. And we see, South Africa, and the 2 other hubs, as we call them, connectivity hubs, we see is Kenya and Nigeria. And this is 3-4 years ago. Now if we go to 2020, it should be 2020. Oh, sorry, I thought there should have been one more slide in there. I'm not sure, I must have gotten rid of it. But anyway, going directly to this slide, now you see this huge growth. Oh, that worries me that this is the wrong deck. But here we see in 2024, 2023 is like half the size for Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria. But, well, first we'll start with the lines. If you look at the lines between Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and South Africa are huge now. These are getting to the size of connecting to Europe. And you're also seeing a lot of connectivity, smaller connectivity, but connectivity still to the other countries around. So the map is getting very dense. And now the reason why the circles, if you look at 2023, the circles were about half the size. This is because of all the cable cuts. I'm sure you remember this or are aware of it, hopefully, there were the big cable cuts in the Red Sea. So 3 cables went down, and then that was in February, and in March, just off the coast of Côte d'Ivoire, another 4 cables were cut. So this was panic. If you're looking at a perspective of the hyperscalers trying to feed the content of data into Africa, they were worried. And you saw a lot of connectivity added. People were basically, if you lost a route at 100 gig, 200 gig, you added a 100 or 200 gig route to make up for what is lost, okay? And what happened when the cables were reconnected was they didn't get rid of the original 100 or 200 gig links, they kept them, so all of a sudden capacity doubled. Now we have to watch over the next year if they'll reduce or just hold steady, or but so far we've seen them keeping both. Okay. Okay. Now, if we're looking at this, just shows total IP, international IP connectivity, and who the biggest markets are for internet connectivity. Once again, this is international. So Egypt is number one. Okay, by far in the area, but they're in a grouping of all North African countries. In the North African countries, what they have that a lot of the other African countries do not have, except for South Africa, is good broadband connectivity. Not only mobile. Mobile's important, but if you have fixed connectivity, there are 10 times as many mobile subscribers than fixed line subscribers, but each fixed line subscriber uses 10 times more broadband than a mobile subscriber. Yes, this may change a little with 5G, but we'll be seeing fiber increasing as well. So here we see still really good growth in Egypt. South Africa has had a lot of recent growth, but a lot of that I think is the cable cuts. But it's all North African countries and South Africa in the top tier. The next tier down is kind of the growing secondary hubs for all of Africa, Nigeria and Kenya, and Djibouti's in there as well. I don't know if Deimos is in the, but a little difference with Djibouti is it's kind of a transport or transit hub, so not a lot of content lands there, but it passes through to other locations. And then the last tier is Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tunisia. These are kind of the next kind of growing hubs. Now, if we look at the map for Middle East, this is just an historic artifact that the connectivity within the Middle East has not been as strong as connectivity back to the content in Europe. So if you take out Europe, this is what it looks like. So, I mean, Turkey, once again, is kind of, we put it in with Middle East, but it's kind of, we could separate it out as well. But it's Saudi Arabia and UAE are usually kind of the more traditional central. UAE may stand out because such a, a smaller population, et cetera, yet they have a lot of international connectivity. A lot of this may be due to a lot of the data centers that they had, the early move in the data centers. And then Saudi Arabia is basically connected to everybody in the area, large population, et cetera, more international internet demand. And then the same kind of image for Middle East, you see the top countries. Saudi Arabia is through the roof, but to give you an idea where Egypt, it was up there too, in terms of total international capacity, so very high. But other very large ones, Iran, they have a very large population, of course. UAE, not the huge population, but a lot of demand. And a lot of that, once again, probably data centers. And Oman as well ranks up there. And then the next group, Iraq and Qatar, same thing. Iraq probably more population-wise, and Qatar is probably more data center-wise, this pulling in the capacity. And then Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait. And they're all growing, but at a slightly slower rate than you see in the continent Africa. And this is just a quick slide showing that a lot of the smaller countries that are adding a lot are the fastest growing countries in Africa. But for the Middle East, that's what we saw last time. The highest growers are like Jordan is over 20%. Okay, and this is one way we look at it, and this may give you a little bit of insight on what we see more as a kind of diving down to what a hub is and what makes a hub. When I usually give talks, I go to a lot of conferences, especially where It's peering conferences where people come together to figure out how to connect everybody's networks within a metro or within a country. So we've discussed, I've pulled down all of our data sets from TeleGeography to put them together to give ideas on rankings of different cities and how they look for the future to grow or are currently. But as we were discussed before I came on, talking about, of course, a lot of the focus in the past has been to the markets like in the US and Europe, Western Europe and Asia. My interest, and I'm rooting for, is all the developing, emerging hubs in Latin America, Africa, Middle East. So we look at 9 different sets of data. We look at like data centers, but we break it into different groupings, like data centers, the infrastructure, like that's power and space, basically. But also what we're interested in, what we think is important is the internet exchange, because a data center can't be plopped down somewhere without connectivity to function well. So you need connectivity to the local market and to markets around, and we found that a lot of the successful hub regions are where you have very active internet exchanges. And internet exchanges are usually seen as kind of a lot of small companies coming in, but it's true, but a lot of the hyperscalers, they love to see the internet exchange, because if you have an internet exchange, you'll get small companies starting in the internet exchange, and then as they grow, they connect directly to the hyperscaler instead of going through the internet exchange. So, and then we also look at network connectivity. We look at cloud infrastructure, long distance transport. Pricing is always very important. But cloud infrastructure, what we've seen over the past like 10 years or so, especially in the last 5 or 6, is when a cloud or a hyperscaler puts in a cloud region, we see that there's a lot of activity in that area all at once. You see prices come down because what you're doing is you're getting a lot more customers, but at a lower price, so you see prices drop. And then you see they need to connect their data centers. Their data centers can't sit alone somewhere, and they all need like at least 4 connections, separate routes. So they all want a lot of capacity on these. So you see wherever they put these metro or these cloud regions, you'll see capacity all around that city or country will shoot up. And these are kind of some of the indicators that we know cloud region's going to come in, there's going to be a lot of growth in that area. That's why you need those hyperscaler data centers. And then the market potential, we're also looking at the demography, the demographics and the geography. Location, like Cairo's perfect location. And then demographics, the size of the local population, subscribers, fixed broadband, mobile, etc. And then that's kind of bleeds into the local access. Access to power, very important. A lot of places in Africa have some limited access to power, which is going to be problematic that they have to fix. Whereas a lot of North Africa and Middle East have a lot of potential power ready. So that's a positive for the future. And regulations and governance, how easy it is to do business, that also affects scoring or how we look at it. And how we do it is we take the 9 different kind of factors that we look at, and it's all ranked basically 1 to 100, where Frankfurt or Virginia would be like 100, then a small metro that's not connected or has no data centers would be 0. So you want it closer to the edge as possible. But this, I think, is Frankfurt, so you never get to the edge, okay? And then this kind of just shows the different shapes you see in different regions. And now, if we do this and apply this to Middle East, Africa, North Africa, this is what pulls up on ours. So we're not just looking at the power or the megawatts built or the space. We're looking at kind of how the data center fits in the metro, in the region, and how well connected it is. And here, our numbers come up a little different from others because we're looking at many, many different factors. So in the top rankings, there you have Dubai, Fujairah, and Muscat, Cairo. Woo, you did it. Jeddah. And then if you look, these are the top 10 markets over here. And once again, this is a mix of factors that raises everybody up to this level. And the biggest gainers in the next 3 to 4 years, we see Riyadh, Tel Aviv, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Aqaba. And a lot of this, I'm wondering if Aqaba is starting to pull up with, once again, when the subcables were cut in the Red Sea, you saw a lot of activity as everybody relies on the subsea cables. And then they realize, oh, you know, a single point of failure. If we lose subcables there, we also need some fiber to get around those areas. So I know in Egypt you build fiber around as well, and same thing is happening on the Arabian Peninsula where they're starting to look at, but when the need wasn't there, there wasn't a lot of focus on building it, but now after those cuts, we see a lot of demand and we see fiber or the talk of building fiber across the peninsula. So there's another route to get to the Gulf. So this is maybe why we're seeing Aqaba, and then you see a few others down there. But in Riyadh, I'm pretty sure the reason why they're at the top in this is because there's a lot of recent interest in cloud infrastructure and cloud data centers or regions being built in Saudi Arabia, in particular Riyadh, but throughout Saudi Arabia. And then just comparing a few, kind of these are the different strengths of the different areas that at the moment, Dubai was a very early starter in building out data centers. Even for, if I'm not wrong, the first cloud data center was built in Dubai. I think it was Alibaba at the time. And then there was kind of a lull. Well, I'll talk about that more in a sec. But so Dubai was one of the early places where you saw it. So a lot more data centers. The internet exchanges, pretty similar. Pricing, pretty similar. The cloud infrastructure, it's Dubai. That's what I think pushes the score. Long distance transport, yeah, you have it here, but it's more to specific areas. Local access, better, more subscribers and local demand in Cairo. Power, better in Cairo. And this, more talking also about clean energy and renewable energy looking forward. And then geography, and then regulations and governance. So you kind of see different shapes for different reasons. And then we can look at Abu Dhabi versus Riyadh, and these are, you know, looking at Riyadh, very few data centers, but still kind of ranking fairly high. Abu Dhabi is ahead for the moment, but in the next few years that'll change. Pricing similar. Riyadh, now with these include planned data centers, we see a lot more activity there, so they're ranking a little bit higher than than Abu Dhabi at the moment. Local access, very similar. Power, I'm really not sure why Riyadh totally fell. It may be because it was renewable power, and at the moment it's low, but that's one I have to look into. Geography, demographics, very similar. Regulatory, about the same as well. Now this looks at the cloud landscape, just meaning the different cloud providers and where they are in Middle East. I thought I was going to do Africa too. I can tell you about Africa, but in the Middle East, you see a lot of the early activity was UAE. UAE was kind of the early starter getting cloud data centers, and that kind of pushed them in front. And actually, that is probably or maybe one of the reasons why UAE and Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Fujairah were all like areas that are growing as hubs connecting to many different regions, etc. The blue dots are where there's cloud regions. So these are the groupings of cloud data centers. Okay. The dots are on-ramps. And on-ramps are important because these are the location, which is usually a carrier-neutral data center, usually, but it can also be just a data center with where they have edge routers that you can connect directly to the cloud providers to access compute, etc. So you're seeing, and very often when you see on-ramps starting to be built, you'll see cloud data centers or cloud regions that follow. So they're good indicators of what's to come too. And then the red circles are the planned. So cloud regions in 6 countries and 11 metros. There are 8 live and 5 planned. UAE, like we were just saying, has the most live regions. There's 6, 4 in Dubai, 2 in Abu Dhabi. And then looking forward, Saudi Arabia and Israel are tied for second. with 4 each, but planned regions is where Saudi is really going to take off over the next couple of years. So we're going to see a lot of growth there. Oh, and this is just talking about transit pricing, and pricing is very important because in general, what the hyperscalers want to see is lower prices to get to those locations. So the farther the prices drop, the more attractive the location is. And that's where we see, like Johannesburg was the most sought after area for cloud, and everybody goes in through Johannesburg to get to the rest of Africa. But Lagos and Accra are growing, and their prices have been dropping, and they're a lot lower now. It used to be Nairobi was cheaper than everybody except for Johannesburg, but the prices stalled out there, have a little bit, and now the West is actually moving faster. And then Kampala represents all the countries that are inland. So when you have to go from the sea landing, the sea cable landing inland, it's always going to cost more. So that's why you see prices inland a little bit more expensive. But an interesting thing, oh, sorry. 5 minutes, okay, I can do it. Okay, looking at an interesting thing that's happening in Africa is before, to get the IP capacity, you'd have a get a pipe, so you buy capacity, to a cheap IP transit hub, which was usually in Europe. So this is the only way you used to do it. It's called pipe import. But what we're seeing, which is a huge new development in Africa, is you're seeing a lot of local IPT. So you're not buying transport up to Europe, you're actually getting your port in country. And it's only been in the last couple of years that we see this is happening at a cheaper price within Africa. Usually that's a good sign for development. And then I'm going to do these quickly because I'm almost out of time. This just tracks 4G markets, because 4G, going from 3 to 4G or 4 to 5G, that's where you see a boost in demand. And Egypt leads for Africa in 4G. But there's a lot of growth potential in Africa because only 31% of all mobile is 4G right now. Middle East is much different. Very, very good 4G rollout, okay? But you see Iran's up high, but KSA, et cetera. And then this is looking fiber to the home, which is very important. South Africa has very good build out. The rest not, they're growing. Africa is traditionally very, very low. Middle East has much higher penetration, but here we're only looking at fiber to the home. Sorry, Egypt. Sorry, Mohammed. But it's like, this is just looking at fiber, not a DSL. DSL, Egypt conquers all, has the most fixed broadband. Okay, now well, I'm just going to end this with a few maps. And what we were talking about is if you look at IXs are usually a good sign of a growing hub, the number of networks connected to the IX. And this shows a map of numbers or of networks connected to IXs, and you see that South Africa is huge. There's been a lot of growth, a lot of networks connected with IXs. You're seeing the same thing in Kenya and Nigeria, and then in UAE, and we're starting to see up in the upper right, like with Egypt and others, or Cairo. And then CDN are the caches that you're pulling content into, very important in early stages of hub development. And here you're seeing, once again, very similar pattern to the IXs, because very often IXs and CDNs go together. CDNs want to go in IXs to have the most connectivity to them. And then data centers, which y'all have been waiting for. Here we're looking at power, so we're looking at megawatts. This is all pre-2020. You're seeing they were early starters up in UAE and Johannesburg, but this is in up till present. Now we're seeing, okay, a lot of growth. We're seeing up there and down there and a lot more dots. And then this is planned. So we're really going to see a lot of growth. It is in some of the main areas, but you see where Lagos has really taken off now that kind of pricing, local pricing has dropped. More companies are connecting. You're seeing a lot of growth there. Kenya slowed down, but I'm sure Kenya will be up there very quickly. UAE, et cetera, around in there with Cairo, et cetera, you'll be seeing a lot of growth very soon. And then just to wrap up, what we're seeing with all these subcables is we're seeing a lot more redundancy, a lot more connectivity. And this is, if you want to look at the hyperscalers, but hyperscalers are an indicator of where things are going to happen. You see where all these cables are coming together, and there are many cables being built. This is the resiliency that they need, et cetera, to connect to their data centers. So we're seeing a lot of growth. That's a good thing. Carrier-neutral data centers, or data centers that act as carrier-neutral data centers, are also very important. Data center builds, we need them. We need neutral so anybody can come and et cetera. And we're seeing that happen. If you just look at Africa, but not at the rest of the Middle East, you see there's movement like Equinix and Digital Realty that go into Africa and buy existing assets. That's always a good indicator that they see something happening in those areas. They're already in the Middle East ahead of this, so, but now the two regions. And we're seeing the growth of content hubs where in the Middle East and in Africa, where once you have those content hubs, you have more reason for more people to connect to you, to connect to the data, et cetera. So you need those data centers. And all of this means like less reliance on European content and data centers, because if you build them locally, you don't have to go anywhere. Okay. And that's it. Oh, I was just going to say, if you want a couple of maps to look at, go on, and this is all open and free, on Submarine Cable Map, then you can look at all the maps in the world and see where they go, who they are. But the other lesser known map, that's the one I did, it's a cloud infrastructure map. This just shows where cloud infrastructure is being built. We show the on-ramps, the regions, the planned regions, all the way down to the data center level, so you can track that easily. And that's all I have for you. Thank you.